nationalism since the beginning of the capital P progressive era than Donald Trump has been able to do. And I mean, they've had 125 years to get around, go under, ignore, and so on the Constitution. And I'm not going to go into a litany of all the ways. It's in the review that I wrote in Marini's book in the last CRB. So you mentioned that you're worried, the threat that worries you the most is when majoritarianism overrides those things. I totally agree with that. I mean, that's the West. I'm glad we agree. That's the West Coast Straussian in me coming out saying there are certain things, rights come from nature and God, not from votes. Therefore, there are certain things votes cannot overturn, take away, impinge.
Hey there, Chinese name. Good to see you. Good to see everybody. I'm going to see if I can just post this video everywhere. Right now I'm responding to, not sure how much of this was caught before I went live, but I think it was all recorded. Anyway, not to repeat myself, I'm responding and looking at a video which it contains Michael Anton having a discussion about populism and about majoritarianism, which I found very interesting. So, without further ado, we continue.
Just are by nature, and the purpose of government is to secure them. And governments that secure them well are legitimate, just governments. Governments that don't are either illegitimate or non-functioning or just incompetent. Totally agree with that. But I don't see right now any kind of majoritarian
which it contains Michael Anton.
Any of those rights. I see populism seems to me to be more of a majoritarian attempt. If there is a majority, we'll see in the 2020 election. There wasn't one in 2016. But if there is a majority, it's people saying, no, I don't feel that my rights are actually being respected and protected by the government. I feel like the government is a oligarchy, and I want to use the vote to get these things back. So, as to your
audio should be better now. Chinese name, let me know. Yeah, Michael Anton here is criticizing the deep state essentially. He's saying that the administrative state has taken over more and more functions, and as of late, I've become more comfortable with the deep state and its power, because I think they had the chance to be a lot more troublesome to Donald Trump than they actually were, and ultimately a sort of technocratic rule by a professional class may be better than populism. Even if that populism shifts between right-wing and left-wing populism. So I don't agree with... I would have been more in line with Michael Anton earlier on in the Trump presidency or before Trump got elected. But as things stand right now, I'm more comfortable with the administrative state than I am, I think, with the average case of elected officials. So if the reduction of the administrative state means Donald Trump gets to carry out more of his promises, then that's one thing. If it means that that anyone that's elected is much less held in check, that's quite another.
Your point about the leader, I would quote our teacher who you actually knew, who I didn't. Leo Strauss says in On Tyranny, I think I have this word for word, tyranny is a danger coeval with political life. Right? It's an omnipresent danger, and yet I feel the danger of it stalking the United States or Europe because of this populist way of much less than I would probably feel it if I were in ancient Athens or somewhere where tyranny was a far greater imminent danger. I don't see Trump or Salvini or Orban or any of these guys as budding tyrants or would-be tyrants or want-to-be tyrants.
Yeah, this is interesting from Anton. I think I am... Well, Salvini may be the odd one out there in a sense, but it seems to me that both Trump and Orban have significant ambitions. I don't believe that Trump would ever overstep the bounds of say, the term limits and such, but he does have... he has that edge to him, right, where he's attacking very foundational groups and institutions, and you can say, well, he's not trying to be a dictator, and I would absolutely agree with that. But he's also kind of being like, I'd say that his highest ambition would be kind of to be like an FDR figure, just kind of transformative in that way, in terms of both being extremely powerful and being remembered, having the ability to launch these attacks on the other branches and see them through to the point where he can kind of bully from the presidential pulpit. He can bully all these other parts of the government. So I don't know. I hope that the person Michael Anton is debating will jump on this a little bit, because it doesn't seem to me like as remote a risk as tyranny is, we definitely are seeing the growth of the executive branch, and in particular, when you have Trump, withstand a lot of attacks on him and then deliver many back. That does concentrate power even more in the executive hands.
I see that as trying to be the head of the necessary corrective that I was talking about. And then the final point on, well, maybe I have two more points. On Congress not doing its job, I'm with John Marini on this, and I learned this argument from him, but it seems to me the fundamental reason Congress, I agree that it doesn't do its job. The fundamental reason it doesn't do its job is because it long ago decided it doesn't want to. It's easier not to defer all this stuff to the administrative state, take as few difficult votes as possible, raise money, and get reelected. So why do they pass laws and then not knowing what's in them, and then hand them over to executive branch agencies and go, okay, now you write the rules, and the rules are really the laws, not the law itself. That's Congress deliberately saying, I'm giving up, it doesn't care. And then on the parties being so divided, I don't believe that. I think, I disagree with you there. I don't think the parties are ideologically divided today. I think they're actually quite similar. What's different, though, is that the two parties are ideologically dissimilar and opposed to Trump. And Trump isn't yet the...
Yeah, I would disagree rather strenuously with that assertion. I think that Trump is not even that ideological, frankly. What people want Trump to represent is very ideological, but Trump himself is not that ideological at all. He's really more self-serving. If there came a time when he could pivot on essentially any of his stances and gain thereby, I think he would. And he's made that evident. He's made his flexibility very evident, in my view. On the other hand, the two parties, they have an actual ideological divide. And this is where I get frustrated. I think that Michael Anton is essentially like earlier in the conversation, he talked about like a square political compass with authoritarian, libertarian, and then right and left on it. I think people are often misled in terms of underestimating the salience of the right-left divide when opposed to different political dynamics. So I think that in this case, he's seriously underestimating the extent to which our political dynamic is driven by the left and the right and their respective parties, who have serious and foundational differences in terms of their philosophy, and may meet in the middle in terms of policy, but that does not mean that there's not a very deep ideological struggle going on between the two parties. Chinese Name says, the deep state focuses on military technologies and little outside it when it comes to private sector investment, but cutting-edge tech is heavily non-military nowadays, so U.S. only has military edge. I'm not sure about that. I think that the biggest edge for the U.S. is probably in two places. I'd say information technology and healthcare are probably where I would say that the U.S. is, at the forefront in terms of civilian technologies. Neither of those. There was the DARPA thing, but come on. I mean, really, it's not a military project. And yeah, so I don't know about that idea that we're behind, except in technologically, except for military tech. I think that military tech actually is fairly problematic nowadays, with the other side kind of making advancements in terms of, for example, nuclear delivery systems that we don't really counter. I watched some panel about how to make nuclear deterrence great again, American nuclear deterrence great again. And they reiterate how we really haven't invested as much as you might expect in things like missile defense and even delivery systems as of late.
The Republican Party. He may be the future of the party. The party will certainly come more in his direction than it would have had not won the nomination and the election. But there's still a pretty big distinction to be made between Trump and the Republicans, and that's where the divide is. It's sort of Trump and Trumpism versus everybody else, not, to me, it seems Democrat versus Republican.
Well, let me just say that, I am very eager to get to the Q&A. So I'm, I'm not going to offer an extended, a rebuttal.
Okay.
Right.
Chinese name says IT is mostly software. Any decent IQ populace can code software. Hardware is where it's starting to matter more. Not so sure about that. Again, if you look at the American advantages, we basically invented social media as it now exists. We were at the forefront of e-commerce. We got there first, and that does matter fundamentally. If you ever had, if you often had it be the case that other places were the first mover, I think that would change the dynamics quite a lot. I agree that once you've invented a concept, copying it is relatively straightforward. But nevertheless, there is an advantage in being the first mover, and we just look at the valuations of our big tech companies compared to say Europe's competitors, and even in Asia, although those are rising once more. If it was the Asians who were the first movers, they'd pretty much crush us, I think, because they have that very very large population and rising economic tide. But if we keep being the first movers, then we'll keep on having these very very valuable tech sector companies.
Let me just make two quick points and then I'll shut up. Number one, I think Mr. Anton and I have a difference of view about the extent to which Mr. Trump has succeeded in remaking the Republican Party in his own image. And we could, this is a question of political judgment, all things considered. I think we've gone farther in that direction than you do. Secondly, and this is a real disagreement.
Yeah, and that's I think what the left often believes because of what's salient to the left. What's very salient to the left is simply the immigration policy. So the fact that Trump has pulled the Republican Party to him on immigration is just extremely salient to them. But in other terms, again, as I said, broadly speaking, Trump is not very ideological. He has his kind of on-brand stances, but even those he will vacillate on if it comes down to it. And those are not on that foundational, frankly. Like immigration is important, but it hardly defines your political ideology. And then his other signature stance, I suppose, would be on foreign policy, where he's more of a dove. But again, that hardly defines you ideologically. And I think in both of those places, you've seen the Republicans become a lot more dovish, frankly, and than they used to be, and they also have become more opposed to immigration. So they've met Trump basically on Trump's side of the field, but more broadly, no, I don't think that Trump really has even a particular desire to pull the party along in a more foundational sense, in the way that Michael Anton is alluding to, basically towards a more populist direction.
I think this steady drumbeat of attack from the West Coast on the quote-unquote administrative state is totally misguided.
All right.
And I'm sorry that John Marini is not here, so we could involve him in the debate. And if I had a lot more time, I would explain why I think that this drumbeat is totally misguided, but I just wanted to note that difference.
Good.
And now let us proceed.
Okay, I'd just like to ask one question.
Can I make one
Yeah.
very quick way, which is that, look, Another difference between you and me is I actually would like to see Trump transform the Republican Party in a more populist or workers' direction. So it's not, to me, the question is, I think you wouldn't, but you think it's gone farther than I do, whereas I would like to see it. I just don't think it's gone that far.
Look, if he were, completely determined to do the right thing by America's working class,
Yeah.
I'd be a lot happier than I am. We would have an infrastructure program. We would have had a tax bill that was much more heavily weighted towards the well-being of the middle class. I could go on and on. One of my critiques of Trump is that he seems not to have the courage of his own convictions on this crucial point, but seems to me to have yielded a lot of ground, and I'm not sure why.
Well, he never really took that strong a stance, right? I think both Michael Anton and the professor here are reading a lot more into Trump than was ever there in terms of populism, in terms of his attacks on the Wall Street boys, stuff like that. It never was meant to be some kind of huge upset revolution. It was simply like even less than the stuff on immigration was meant to be revolutionary. It's just not Trump. Trump is vociferous, and into that you can read an ideological fervor, but that ideological fervor just isn't there.
But
So I'd just like to hear, Michael, before we open it up, your views a little bit more about Trump and what he stands for in a positive way, and what you welcome. And I know what sort of launched you to national fame in 2016 was the essay on the Flight 93 election.
Although most people didn't know who I was, so I wasn't that famous.
Yeah, well,
Still not very.
but
we can never be too thin or too famous.
Can you talk a little bit about what your concerns were then, and substantively the three areas that you saw Trump addressing?
I mean, to me, his core campaign, they say, sort of a truism in politics, if you hire a very expensive political consultant and you say, I'm going to run for office, what should I do? I'm going to pay you, $200,000 a month to run my campaign. These guys make a lot of money. And one of the pieces of advice they always give you is pick your issues, 3 or 4 tops, and just hammer them. Talk about nothing else. Don't try to have 10, don't try to have 15, don't try to go into, try to answer every question, just hammer your 3 issues over and over again. And Trump did that. That's one of the reasons I think he won. And they were immigration, trade, and foreign policy. And to me,
sponsored in part by
China. Much more of an immigration hawk in the sense of restrictionist, in the sense of I wanted to see a more secure border, I wanted to see sensible policy reforms. I was not in sync with the Republican Party on that question for a long time. I never thought very much about trade. I just took the conservative argument for granted that it's just good. It makes the GDP go up, and it's immoral to restrict it, and so on, and therefore it's good. So Trump comes along talking about tariffs, and we're going to renegotiate these deals. My gut reaction to that was, this is probably a bad idea, and it won't work out. But the more I read him and studied him and went back and reread some of the old books that I had studied in grad school, I thought he had a pretty good case, and he brought me around on that. On war, it was more of a personal conversion, if you will. I was in the Bush White House for the first term of George W. Bush. I was a supporter of the Iraq War. I'm one of the people who made arguments in its favor.
I haven't heard Michael Anton say that a lot, or even before now. It might be interesting to review those arguments. Kind of a Tucker Carlson-esque figure. Similarities, yeah. More similar to Tucker Carlson than may meet the eye initially. They were both anti-Iraq war and then became, or pro-Iraq war and then became strongly against it. Yeah, we might not find anything. Let's see if we can get. We should try to make it so that we only get, let's say 11-2000 to 11-2007. Comment says Americans are perpetually black-pilled about a coming collapse incoming next year every year, so they're paranoid about weird stuff that improve QOL and the JQ. Well, you're describing kind of the far-right fringe of America, but I would agree with that characterization. Yeah, they expect a collapse every year. Bush was charismatic at the time. Even Ann Coulter loved Bush. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, basically, I think that the whole conservative commentariat loved Bush, although I wasn't paying much attention to politics at the time. Yeah, and you also like Bush. Yeah, I think it was basically ubiquitous, although Greg Cochran did not. Michael Anton. Yeah, he's just basically. So far, it doesn't look like. It looks like basically he was a spokesperson of some kind, and he gave the administration talking points. Anyway.
And by about 2007, I and some of my other friends had concluded that it was a mistake. It didn't do what, leaving aside the WMD question, which is hard to leave aside, but try for the moment, leave that aside. The promises of what it would do to and for the Middle East and for American security were not borne out by what actually happened. And so finally hearing a Republican, and by the way, I'm totally convinced there's many reasons, but that's one of the main reasons Barack Obama became president. Because the American people had concluded that too, and they're looking at a Democratic field, fairly small, because Clinton had so much money in 2008 and so on. Nobody thought she was beatable, but she voted for that. And Obama could say credibly, even though he wasn't in the Senate when it happened, he was, I think, out of politics at the time, right? Because he lost that congressional race in 2000, or maybe he had still been in the Illinois legislature. But he was on the record from the beginning saying, before it happened, this is a bad idea, it's a mistake, and it's not going to work. And so he could go credibly to Democratic primary voters and say, hey, I don't have to have a conversion experience to be popular with you now.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. It was absolutely crucial to Obama that he had that differentiator. He was against the Iraq War from the start. Yeah, absolutely agreed. And it did help Trump during the campaign, although I'm not sure how much. I think it was another big differentiator between him and the other candidates. I found it, and I still find it disappointing that people are unable to about face on that. In one sense, it's good that they're honest, that they'll stick by their guns, but I mean, it's just such a disastrous foreign policy decision that I'd love to see it repudiated. But somehow, still in 2016, it was the issue du jour for quite some time.
This question, I was against it. So Trump saying that appealed to a conclusion that I had already drawn a decade or so before, maybe a little less, 8 years before, that this had been a mistake, and it's high time somebody, the Democrats they already had Howard Dean, who, for whatever reason, didn't make it to the nomination in 2004. Had he done so, he might have beaten Bush, I think, because the war was already so popular. But the Republicans hadn't had anybody repudiate it or talk more sensibly about a less ambitious foreign policy until Trump. And he was, of course, savaged for that by not merely his opponents in the primary field, but by official conservatism, the magazines, the think tanks, and so on.
Okay. Let's open it up. Our tradition is to allow students to ask the first questions.
Do we have microphones?
Not out there.
That causes a cognitive dissonance because the very institution that you mentioned as being inhibitive on that popular expression, say the Electoral College, are in fact the institution that allowed the victory of the Trump administration during the election, right? Trump lost by 3 million votes. So is it
Hey, Ultra Testosterone, good to see you.
still accurate to call the Trump administration truly populist, knowing that when it came down to the expression of the people, they didn't actually give them that mandate?
Well, look, I assume you mean losing the popular vote by 3 million or whatever the final tally was. Populism or democracy, if you want to get back to the Greek and Latin roots of the words, doesn't mean the whole people. It means the demos is a part of the entire system.
True, but you were earlier talking about majoritarianism as a crucial check on spiraling elite power, or spiraling divides between parts of the country. And I think that it's apropos that, in fact, the person who you laud as the avatar of these energies was not elected by popular vote. I think it's germane.
Citizen body, right? Just as the populare are a part of the citizen body. Even Plato and Aristotle would say there's no way to have 100% consensus, except the late Charles Krauthammer had a funny line that he would use, called it the Tirana Index, meaning that every time the tyrant of Albania had a vote in his country, it would be like 98.5% re-voted him into office. And he would add that little bit of people who didn't vote for him just to sort of pretend like this was real. The Tirana Index was how brazen tyrants were in claiming that they had universal support. In America, functionally speaking, 60% is about the best anybody's ever done. And even then, so you've got 40% of the people that didn't vote for something, right? If you're going to define populism by total full consensus, then I would say, well, of course, Trump is not a populist. I'm defining it more by the middle class, the forgotten people not currently served by the current arrangements, which do very well for the elites, to some extent do very well for those in the bottom of the income ladder, but have done not well at all for the broad middle. And whatever that broad middle turns out numerically to be, they certainly have a lot in common with the demos, or the common people, or the populares, which is, I think, why we use that term. But even if Trump were able to reform the Republican Party.
Well, he says that. He says these forces behind Trump have that the aura, the essence of the populares. I don't know. I don't know that that's the case for the Republicans more than the Democrats. I really don't. I think if you look at the average incomes, it's very, very similar between Democrats and Republicans, but Republicans have higher incomes. And on the whole, there's that forgotten America trope, which is spun out again and again. Trump represented the forgotten. But, as much as I would abhor much of the politics of the left, it can't be denied that a large part of the Democrats' voting base is neglected. It is if not forgotten, at least in fairly dire straits. And we can't minimize that. The reality is that there's a lot of populist energy coming from that side, and that populist energy is saying, "Give us more, give us more. We're in trouble. We're suffering," and they are suffering. It's not a lie, right? It's just that you don't necessarily help in the long run by giving to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities. In the long run, that tends to result in spiraling needs and collapsing abilities. But to say that the Democrats are not populist, I don't know. I think that that's going a bit far.
And build the kind of coalition that I don't know to say that I envisioned, but that I permitted myself to dream of and hope for in 2016, even if that were all happen in 2020 and then carry over to a future Republican Party, you're still looking to get 55-60% of the vote max, right? And politics goes on. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
In the front?
I was surprised that this guy didn't want to pick that up at all.
Hi, my name's Jacob Martin. I first of all wanted to thank both of them for coming here. I really enjoyed this
William
discussion.
Galston, that's who
My
it is.
question was relating to the Ukrainian election with Zelensky, a comedian, and with the upcoming European elections in the United Kingdom, where I'm from originally. Two candidates put forward by UKIP are YouTubers, specifically Carl Benjamin and Mark Nietzsche. So there seems to be this rise of less and less qualified people for elected office running under more mainstream populist parties. So do you think that's going to either help or hinder the rise of all populism in Europe and America?
Well, a couple of comments. First of all, what populist theorists say about the United States, I think largely incorrectly, that it's a corrupt regime, is certainly true in Ukraine. And so if I were a Ukrainian voter, would I consider voting for a comedian rather than Mr. Poroshenko? I would consider it, yes. If I'd been in Italy, during the period of the rise of the Five-Star Movement, would I have considered voting for a television comedian, as opposed to the Christian Democrats or the other established parties? Conceivably. Having said that, voting for comedians is a sign of desperation. It's a declaration of...
Was voting for an actor a sign of desperation when Reagan was elected? I'm not sure. I think it basically reflects... well, it used to be the case that you had to be you had to have risen through the ranks either in government or in the military. But we've become more and more of an entertainment-oriented society, in a more entertainment-oriented world than we used to be. And so inevitably people are going to come from the entertainment sector more, as it becomes a big thing. And yeah, a sign of desperation. Well, I think that there's enough precedent at this point that electing a dashing, well-known figure from outside either military or government is not really desperation, but something that happens with a fair amount of regularity in politics. Although I would absolutely agree that the Ukrainians are indeed desperate.
The bankruptcy of the old order.
Chinese name says, I like strong state, authoritarian, benevolent dictatorship / state focused on good statecraft, some central planning. State should crush irresponsible market actors. Well, the problem with that philosophy is that you lose dynamism, but more importantly, a lot of important things are unglamorous, and those are done very, very badly under these state-oriented economies. Some things you can excel in particular some military affairs, and whatever you're really focusing on. But in order to muster the joie de vivre to make a really good car, those rewards need to accrue to the car maker, right? You're not going to bust your ass to make a slightly better consumer product again and again and again and again. You're not going to bust your ass even as some really low level farmer to meet to get not only your quotas passed in, but also high quality produce, also dry, not soggy, all that sort of thing. These things need attention, and that's really where these centrally planned economies tend to fail. Is not in terms of being unable to make great rockets, because they could make great rockets, but not being able to really accomplish all these miscellaneous tasks which require a lot of care and a lot of intelligence, but which no one's going to bother to do if they're not remunerated for it. I see these essential motivating factors as being greed or fear, and in terms of fear, you're overwhelmingly bent towards state solutions in the first place. But in terms of greed, if you just try to erase that, a lot of things just don't get done, like at all, or just get done very, very badly. And eventually you stop being afraid, and then even that collapses, right? There's a cost to being motivated by fear, as the Soviets were, and that cost was all the lives they lost to wars before. Once they stopped losing lives to war, they stopped being motivated by fear, and the whole thing just kind of collapses at that point.
And I do not see the United States as being in the same category as Ukraine. But people who use this term corruption lightly, I think, see more of a similarity between Ukraine and the United States than I do. One other point, and this will show you how old-fashioned I am. I do think that there are indeed qualifications for high office in a republic, in a liberal democracy. Call it what you will. I do not view, I mean, the late William F. Buckley once said that he would rather be governed by 100 people drawn at random from the, Cambridge telephone book than 100 people drawn at random from the Harvard faculty. Would I like to be governed by people drawn randomly from the American populace? If I had a mechanism for determining qualifications and voting.
But what's that mechanism, right? What's the what are the qualifications that you want? That becomes very troublesome, right?
For the most qualified? Hell no. And so I do think we have to hold fast to the idea that although there may not be a science of politics, there are qualifications for more or less effective political leadership. One of the problems we have right now is that our mechanism for selecting leaders no longer reliably map onto the kinds of qualities we're looking for. And we, I'm afraid, have...
Yeah, but what qualities are we looking for, right? He wouldn't have said that probably about Hillary Clinton, but Clinton's qualifications were primarily by virtue of being part of a string of failures, right? She was there when things were happening. They weren't good things, but she was there, and thus she's qualified. But that's not a good notion of qualification. That you've been tried out and found to be bad is worse than if you hadn't been tried out at all. Ideally, we'd have a bunch of people who have been tried out and who have, got good results, and are vetted in that sense. But that doesn't seem to be that common for people to have serious good results, and run for the presidency and make it. It's hard to say. We have this system that delegates so much that it's hard for any individual to take all that much responsibility. And if you were to be part of a string of successes, it would be as part of some administration that had that modus operandi. But there haven't been really any administrations lately that are a string of unbroken successes. That's I think where federalism is really interesting. Is you can have all these experiments and from there just take the best. And I guess that Obamacare was such a case where Mitt Romney became the architect of America's healthcare system because it worked in Massachusetts. And so after it works in Massachusetts, you just bring it nationwide. I'm kind of rambling, but yeah, I don't like what the sort of thing that this William Galston calls qualifications. I want people who have successes under their belt. And Trump did not have government successes under his belt, but he at the very least had media successes under his belt. And that's something. That's more than having presided over bad decision after bad decision in the public sector.
Constructed institutions that disserve us.
I just, very quickly, I don't follow Europe as closely as I could to give you like a great answer to your question. Caldwell does. He should be here to answer it. But I will say this, two things very quickly. One is that my sense from UKIP is that they kind of folded up the tent and thought their job was done after the Brexit vote. And certainly Farage seems to say, all right, it's it, mission accomplished. And so, therefore, it's not terribly surprising to me that people trying to carry on the banner when the more serious people who did the founding and the hard legwork have kind of gone home, that those are lesser quality people. The second thing I would say, or less serious, or lesser quality candidates, I guess, is what I would say is, it could turn out to be a problem in the sense that, I'll give you the domestic example. 2010, we all know, was a wave election for the for the Republicans, the first congressional election after Obama's 2008 victory. And it was a year of the Tea Party ferment. And what happened was a lot of people very, very popular with the Republican base won some pretty low turnout but high energy primaries, and lost Senate, congressional, and gubernatorial seats that the Republicans almost certainly would have won had they had somebody else. And it divided the party pretty badly because you had McConnell and others saying, well, I'm not going to fund these races because these people are going to lose. They're just going down, so it's a waste. I got to put it where it works. And others who were super enthusiastic thought they were being betrayed by the Republican elite and so on. But McConnell's point was candidate quality matters, and it turned out he was right. I don't know how that's going to play out in Europe, but I think they may, if they don't already understand that lesson, they may be about to learn it.
Thank you. Oh, well, right here. Go ahead.
To your point that populism promotes, to your point that populist leaders promote the interests of their constituents, do you believe that leaders of populist movements can hide an authoritarian regime behind the mask of a populist state? I use Orban's limit on freedom of
Korean name, I guess, says Japan is stagnant and most of their immigrants are Chinese/Koreans. They've been trying to increase more Southeast Asian laborers, but they have bigger problems. Is Japan more stagnant than South Korea, you'd say? Is it broadly speaking in a culturally much worse position? I was reading an article about how if current fertility trends continue, the North Korean young men will outnumber South Korean young men within like 30 years or 40 years. So I think that all the rich East Asian countries are having insane fertility problems, like worse than the West, by a significant shot. And this is where we can be glad to have more examples from around the world. It really helps us isolate down the causes, because it has to be something that's common to both East Asian countries and us.
press and a free and fair election, as well as Poland's non-justice party restricting the judiciary.
I mean,
It sounds like the question.
yeah, I mean, of course that can happen. I mean, that's the classical way, going all the way back to the early Greek tyrants. You come to power, you ride the backs of the people. You don't come to power typically for a tyrant. Doesn't come to power on the backs of the elite, although that happens too. So of course it can happen. The question is, what do we think the examples you cited are genuine examples? I take Orban seriously when he calls his movement illiberal democracy, and he has a very specific meaning by what he means as liberal, and therefore what he is opposing in being illiberal. It is that kind of consensus, globalist consensus I talked about, that he sees dominates all the Western capitals and Brussels and so on, and wants Hungary to do its bidding. And it's a difficult position that he and the Poles have placed themselves in, because they're obviously chafing at EU regulations and so on, but they chose to go in.
Ultra asks, what do you think of E. Michael Jones? I don't like him, but I also don't know that much about him. What I've seen of him seems to be that same conspiratorial, like far-right edge that I've come to loathe, and I haven't really been impressed by any of his logic. But I don't know him that well.
Into the EU. They wanted to be into the EU, I think, for essentially geopolitical reasons, coming out of.
He says they want to be in the EU for geopolitical reasons, also economic reasons. They want access to those. They want access to those EU firms and EU markets.
Out from behind the Iron Curtain, being liberated from Soviet rule, they really wanted to join Europe and be seen as full partners and equal partners in the European project. And now they're finding that that's got some carrying costs that they don't really like. They don't want to get out, but they also don't.
Korean guy says they always say that demographic trends are just trends. Situations can change. But yes, Japan is culturally and socially stagnant. Huh. Well, yeah, they can change, but they can also change in the other direction, is the thing. That's what I don't like about that logic, right? Of course the demographic trends can change, but they can change for the better, or they can change for the worse, or they can do something weird besides that. Our projections are just the best guess, but as much as things can improve, they can also get worse. Japan is culturally stagnant, you say. Well, the Koreans definitely seem more, how to put it, their media seems to have more play, and yeah, they seem to be innovating quite a lot. But I don't think their economy has reached the per capita level of Japan, or maybe it's similar at this point. I know that the Japanese have some quite impressive physics work that they're doing, and they're one of the world's biggest steel producers and stuff like that. I don't know. And they have obviously all sorts of high-tech sectors going on there. Do you think that South Korea will eclipse Japan? Let's see. Yeah. I mean, the gap is definitely narrowing, but nevertheless, like, I kind of look at all these East Asian countries and imagine them in the long run essentially converging with Japan. That, like, on a per capita basis. That's kind of my guideline for that region's future, at least. Maybe something else will happen, but yeah. Let's see. Korean guy says cars aren't really cutting edge high tech instead of autonomous technology. Well, they're also cutting edge in terms of material science is important with their engines and their construction and all that. I don't know. I mean, it seems like a good thing to insource.
Don't want to go along with the program entirely, and I'm actually sympathetic to them on that score without specific knowledge on exactly what they're doing left and right. I don't know. I don't want to endorse or condemn some policy that I don't know enough about. But in the main, from what I've read, and I've read a lot of Orban's speeches.
South Korea total patents have eclipsed Japan. I don't know about that. That patent warfare. It reminds me of the quotes about how many scientific articles come out of China. Measuring a country's scientific output by the number of papers is, well, yeah, I mean, it's like measuring the output of a writer by how many pages they write. Like, you don't really care about the pages being written, you care about the impact of what's being written. And so I don't really care how many patents South Korea has. What I care about is the impact of South Korean inventions, the impact of South Korean industry compared to Japanese. And so far, Japan seems like a bigger player, but South Korea is catching up. And, I wish them the best of luck. Hey, Halsey! Halsey is in the chat. Excellent.
Read some things about him.
Korean name says, do you not have a computer? I have a computer. It's a Lenovo.
Caldwell, who I will mention one more time, just went over there and came back. His next article in the Claremont Review of Books is going to be about Hungary. I haven't read it yet. I look forward to it. I think he's the best observer.
Yeah, there's a lot of Korean tech around. I'm not saying that there isn't. There's tons of Korean tech around. There's also tons of Japanese tech around, and Japanese cultural influence too. So, yeah, I don't know. We have some Korean, Japanese, grudges, long-lived grudges. But yeah, I mean, overall, I think, without a doubt, Japan has been more impactful than Korea on the whole. But Korea is catching up.
Of Europe, I know, and so I take a lot of my cues from him on those questions.
I have a somewhat less benign view of Mr. Orban, because when he talks about illiberal democracy, I don't think he's just, rejecting European progressive values. I think he is attacking institutions that I see close to the heart of liberal democracy. Let me give you one example: a free press.
Yeah, both Orban and Trump have attacked the press quite a lot, and I would agree with Michael Anton that they're not going to become dictators, and they're not all that big a threat to democracy. But to say that there isn't any sort of authoritarian edge to either of those people seems odd.
The Hungarian government, directly or indirectly, now controls nearly 100% of the Hungarian media. I don't know whether Mr. Caldwell is going to stress that point or not. This is not a formula for effective popular government. It's a formula for message control from the top. The expulsion of the Central European University was not consistent with liberal tolerance as I understand it, and a robust civil society. I know that Mr. Orban has some problems with Mr. Soros, at whose trench he once sucked, but that's a different question. So when Viktor Orban pioneers the idea of illiberal democracy, I think he's dead serious in my sense of liberal democracy. And he has evoked an enormous reaction throughout Central and Eastern Europe. He is seen as the ideological leader, not just by the Poles, but by the entire Visegrad group. He used opposition to Angela Merkel's policy, to thrust himself forward as the leader of the pack. But he has used the political power that he gained through that opposition in order to try to engineer a system that will guarantee his reelection in perpetuity. I hope he fails. So I think Mr. Anton and I have a pretty significant disagreement about the actual significance and meaning of Mr. Orban's regime.
May I?
Yeah.
I guess I would ask, meaning for whom? I don't know that it carries a whole lot of meaning for us. But when it comes, I think I said this already in print somewhere, so I might as well say it again. How many people didn't get in trouble and want to keep trying? Why is it I wonder why it's any of our business in a lot of these things. Now, if there are regimes around the globe that are doing truly horrible, terrible things, and we have the power to stop it, and there's some direct U.S. interest involved, I can see why we might intervene or sanction.
Well, this is interesting from Mike Anton, because he earlier did combine them and say Salvini, Trump, and Orban are not threats to democracy. But then now he's saying, well, what can we do about it, and should we do anything about it anyway? Which is quite, a change in tack, in my view. Like, regardless of whether we can do anything about it, we can characterize it as being anti-democracy or not.
Or condemn or whatever. I don't know, though, why America needs to feel strongly about what Hungary is doing with regard to the press. Like, why it has to be. I don't think our press is threatened by what he does over there. And in fact, I would argue, I expect you to disagree with this. You say it's run totally by the top. I'll take your word for it. From what I read of our press, the control is a bit looser, but we certainly can't say it's run by the top. If by the top we mean the White House, the press 99% hates Trump and covers him very negatively all the time. The press overwhelmingly seems to me to be on the side of the elite, bipartisan, kind of globalist, neoliberal economic consensus that Trump ran against. So there might be, in a way, an informal parallel between a monolithic press siding with one side of the political debate over here and one over here, even though the root of it is different. It's not state-owned, it's all.
Okay.
Okay.
And then we'll go back out here.
Absolutely, and I'm willing to stay a little bit over.
Yeah,
in
okay.
order to answer all of the questions. I really do think, we have reached a point of significant disagreement. I am not in favor, of sallying forth abroad to slay monsters. I was a fervent opponent of the Iraq War before it began, and spent spent the summer and fall before it broke out arguing in any forum that would have me, and arguing mainly with my liberal hawk friends that this was a big mistake. And I'm not saying that as an anti-war warrior. I was in the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War, for heaven's sake. But it just seemed to me to be an obviously misbegotten venture. Having said that, there is indeed a reason why the United States of America should care about the character of regimes in other countries, even if it should not intervene in order to alter the character of those regimes. There is a natural friendship between and among liberal democracies.
Yeah, I wish he'd push his point forward further. Like, regardless of, it doesn't really matter. Like, Europe and the rest of the world could just be a projection on a screen, which is we know to be a high fidelity simulation of humans. And even at that point, it would matter. Even if it was only that, it would still matter because it's data that we have on how things are going in other countries. If other countries in the modern 21st century descend into authoritarian right-wing rule, that ups the chance that we're going to descend into authoritarian right-wing rule inherently, because even though they have all those differences, there are also similarities. So, yeah, I don't buy this notion. It's like, well, why should we care? That's always a dodge when they say that. And you're perfectly happy to talk about it earlier, right? It's only when confronted with examples of illiberality that you then say, why should we even care?
A world in which there are more liberal democracies is a world in which liberal democracy in America is safer. Franklin Roosevelt understood that in the 1930s, that if he held back, and tried to build Fortress America, and was surrounded by the forces of fascism from Asia and from Europe, that ultimately democratic institutions in the United States would be placed in jeopardy. And one of the things that I'm most critical of the Trump administration about is its evident indifference to the idea that liberal democracies have something important in common that is not transactional, cannot be reduced to dollars and cents, but is profoundly important for the safety and happiness of the United States in the long run.
Even during the Peloponnesian War, it mattered what the ideology was of the colonies, even though things were far more realpolitik back then, far more hard-edged and transactional. Nevertheless, it mattered what the ideological bent of the states were. So what this person is saying is eminently sensible. The more ideological commonality we have, the less likely it is that we're going to fight, although there are many other factors that can induce a fight besides ideological differences.
I do not think that American foreign policy can treat as morally equivalent dictators, authoritarians, and democratic leaders. It's one thing to disagree with some of Angela Merkel's policies.
Well, he says that, but I think that in many cases we can put dictators way above democratically elected people. Not if there are no other differences, but if they are better for us than the democratic alternative, we don't need to always go with our ideological bent. We can also go with pragmatism, and we should be unashamed of that. That's what everyone does and what everyone has done throughout history. It makes no sense. Like, I can like greyhounds a lot, right? I can love greyhounds and hate German shepherds, but that's a fair enough thing for me to say. But if an individual greyhound is nipping at me and an individual German shepherd is licking my hand, well then I should go with the German shepherd, irregardless of my ideological or my my instinctive or my emotional ties based on the kind. So in the same way, if there's a dictatorship which is very pro-America and which really helps American national interests, we ought not be enemies to them, and we should not even be constantly badgering them to become more democratic. It doesn't make sense. I agree with the fellow that all else equal, and even if things are relatively similar, there should be a fairly high degree of favoritism towards ideologically similar states. But it's a factor among many, and the most important factor is their friendliness to us, not their ideology.
Prefer MBS to Angela Merkel? That's an outrage. I'm sorry.
I don't want to keep going back and forth if we want to open the question.
Yeah,
I don't know that he actually prefers, but
Well, he sure acts as though he prefers. He criticizes Merkel every week.
Bill, you're just wrong about Orban. In the last election, about half of the press was pro-Orban, about half of it was against him. What happened when he lost? He was prime minister 1998 to 2002. He lost. He had zero support from the press. He talked to the socialist prime minister. He said, well, create your own press. Orban said, fine. So essentially what he did was create his own Fox News. And so instead of being 100% against him, now it's about 50-50. I mean, that's essentially what happened in the press. As far as the judges were concerned, the judges used to, the same thing happened in Poland, they used to appoint themselves. People talk about judicial independence, but the judges in, they would choose, they essentially choose their successors to various committees and so on. What's happened in both Poland and Hungary is a system more like the United States where elected politicians get to nominate judges. I mean, this has been a large charge of the attack on Poland and Hungary. Dan Mahoney, you were mentioning him, he has a terrific article in Hungary and Poland, just came out in the 11th food incident. But I'll have one quick question for you, because this is also related to Hungary and what you were saying in Miracle. What is a more democratic body, the European Parliament or the Hungarian Parliament?
I know what I say clearly the Hungarian Parliament.
Yeah, but that's not the comparison I was urging, right?
Or even what's more liberal in terms of hate speech and that sort of thing?
Look, I think that Germany is an incredibly valuable ally of the United States, despite our policy differences. It is an incredibly valuable ally, in part because of its wholehearted embrace of liberal constitutional democracy as its ruling principle, and its defense of that against a lot of pressure. So I just return to my main point. I think we need a foreign policy organized around the principle that the American national interest is best served by the defense of democracy where it is and the spread of democracy where it isn't.
Well, to a point, yes, but only to a point. It can never be allowed to overrule the most crucial factor of allegiance and who is making positive overtures to us and who is working with us and who is working against us. If you privilege ideology over those pragmatic factors, you're driven very swiftly into madness. It just leads to really insane decisions. And, the Iraq War was in significant part motivated by that kind of thinking.
Cannot be neutral on that question. To
I agree with you on that.
repeat, does that mean Bush's second inaugural? No. That was the most, with the possible exception of January of 2017, that was the most over-the-top inaugural address in American history. But it does mean that a policy that exudes indifference to the regime characteristics of our allies is morally unacceptable. And it doesn't serve our national interest either. This is not blind moralism.
Questions? More questions? You can talk about this forever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, you're
Hello, thank you very much. So I'm sure both of you are familiar with the definition of populism offered by
Apparently, COE is streaming. See, maybe it'll be interesting.
That Christmas was utilitarian, so they had like 50 some holidays in order to, not have people need so much time off of work. They reduced it to two, Good Friday and Christmas, and Christmas gained much more prominence. And in the industrial age, you combined it with the commercial aspects like gift giving and raises, where Christmas brings out the best in people. So even like if it's
mood that populism is, or populism is a thin ideology that separates society into two antagonistic and homogenous groups, the pure people and the corrupt elite, and where the populists claim to speak on behalf of the pure people, and they claim a moral monopoly on truth and reject opposition as illegitimate. If I recall correctly, this is what Mood says populism is and populists do. One, do you agree with that understanding of populism? And two, if you do, then doesn't that make populism inherently hostile to liberal democracy because it undermines the deliberation that makes liberal democracy possible?
So I guess I don't agree with that definition. I would say, though, that phenomena that you described exists. Maybe it needs a different name. Maybe populism should be called something else. Maybe we need to just come up with a bunch of different names. But what's being exhibited right now in the United States and Europe, it seems to me, does not, to me, presage any of those threats. It's, as I said, a corrective. It's people who feel like it doesn't matter what they vote for. Whatever it's voted on never gets enacted, right? So people have been saying in Europe and in the United States for a long time, we want less immigration and we want a secure border, and they never get it. They've been really irritated by, for a long time, by trade deals. And it doesn't matter if the Republicans win or the Democrats win, and the people say, I don't want more of this, they keep getting more of it. And we were on the cusp of enacting one of the largest ever, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that was a major issue in the lead up to the 2016 campaign. And that's one of the things that I think fueled Trump. So there's a sense in which my definition of populism, or whatever we want to call it, the phenomena that drove Brexit, that drove Trumpism, that's behind Salvini and so on, is a sense of a non, obviously it's not the whole people, it's not 100%, but a very large proportion of people saying, many, many times I have voted for X, and even candidates have won who said they were going to do X, and I never see it. Why is this happening? And they feel like they're being cheated by a corrupt elite. And I have to say, I sympathize with them a little bit when it seems like the system, no matter what you vote for, no matter what happens, ostensibly at the ballot box or in public rhetoric, does not change the direction of policy. They got angry and they revolted.
I don't.
There was also a revolt of that kind in Switzerland with the referendum on the minarets, but that was roundly ignored, as Swiss referenda often are. Thinking back, yeah, I'm not sure of this narrative that Anton is using here. We always attempt to cohere these events into a single narrative. But, referenda either getting uncomfortably close to moving against elite opinion or just going against elite opinion entirely. That's not that uncommon, right? And I worry about trying to make it into a narrative that's so vulnerable to the sort of criticism that you saw from that audience member. If you were to define the energies behind Brexit, the energies behind Trump, a lot of it is concern about demographics, and that's what's been so absent in this discussion on populism, is discuss about concern around immigration and demographic change, because that's a large part of what's driving this discontent, and he to try to shoehorn all of this into the elites are too powerful. Well, it doesn't quite, it's not exactly, the shoe doesn't exactly fit. The concern of these, of Tory voters is not primarily with leveling the playing field. People like that will vote Labour. It's with the culture issue, right? And the culture issue is often a euphemism for, or not even a euphemism for immigration, the national character changing, and whether you have a right to your own national character, to distinctions between nations, to borders. That's really the issue here at hand, and elites are a problem for the populist right insofar as they stand in the way of that. But the left is also populist. Okay, the people that the left is mobilizing and also trying to get into the country, they're a lot of people. It's not unpopulist.
I don't agree with his definition either. So I think I've made clear. I think his definition of populism as a thin ideology is too thin, and I've tried to say why. But I do view the division of the people, into the good and worthy folks and then everybody else, as inherently dangerous.
Right, but I hope he'll say happening on both sides.
And let me say why. In the United States anyway, for the United States, I don't think a definition of justice as benefiting your friends and harming your enemies is a defensible operating principle for the President of the United States. I cannot give any other construction to this.
Well, why is that not defensible, my dude? I mean, it seems to me like anyone who's not cleaving to that, at least in large part, is basically enveloping us in seas of blood. Right? We have to, if we don't care whether somebody is helping us or not, like, that's madness inducing for everybody. We're already almost incomprehensible because of our ideological bent to everybody else in the world. Okay, nobody else in the world understands your liberal shit. Okay, no one understands it at all. But if you add to that you're going to make it the king over everything else, you just look like a total madman. The lion's share of your actions have to be reciprocal, have to be transactional, because nobody understands your ideology, but everybody understands that if you help America, America will be good to you. Everybody understands that. It's the only thing they're ever going to understand. Never assume that anyone will ever understand your ideology abroad. You know, they don't even care to understand. It doesn't even matter to them. What matters to them is, what do I do? How do I avoid the scenario where America is trying to hurt me? And there has to be a straightforward way to do that does not involve ideological games, but instead is transactional. You help America, America is not going to kick you. And if that's not true, I mean, you're just enveloping the country in seas of blood.
Recent gambit about sending immigrants to sanctuary cities, then the use by the President of the United States of the power of his office indeed ultra varies in order to reward his friends and punish his enemies. Operating principle for the President of the United States. I cannot give any other construction to this recent gambit about sending immigrants to sanctuary cities than the use by the President of the United States of the power of his office indeed ultra varies in order to reward his friends and punish his enemies. And I think that is just a big, big mistake. You no doubt disagree.
Well, I just want to say the following.
Okay. And then we'll take a last round of questions.
We know from, well, I'll leave that part out. Look, if the immigration point, as you say, I think you concede a lot of ground when you say that sending immigrants to sanctuary cities is punishing enemies, when the whole premise of the sanctuary city and of the left that he's talking about is immigrants are a boon, illegal immigrants are a boon and a benefit everywhere. So it's not a punishment, right?
But he sees it as a punishment.
Well, but I think the gambit, you say you can see no other basis for that gambit. I think the fundamental basis for that gambit is he's trying to illustrate hypocrisy on the part of his political opponents. They say they want X, but when it actually is going to affect them directly, they all of a sudden go, oh, we don't actually want that, and you're a bad man for suggesting it. He's demonstrating in a rather blunt way, and maybe an inappropriate way, but certainly in a direct way and in an effective way, that his opponents don't really have the courage of their convictions on that question, and probably.
And in addition, it's a response to an attempt to make an end run around the laws of this country, right? In a most fundamental sense. These sanctuary cities are utterly changing the fabric of this country and utterly undermining the capacity of this country to control who stays here. So that's an incredible step for them to be taking. And it's hard for me to imagine a step that's too far in response to that by their ideological opponents. It's absolutely it's a bold-faced attempt to make a complete end run around our immigration policy with these sanctuary cities. So, I can't disagree more with what's his name again, William Galston here about this being an overstep by Trump. It's like, oh, he just wants to punish his enemies. Well, his enemies, so to speak, they have gone really, really far before he ever did anything. Before Trump even stepped on the stage, they had gone really, really far in terms of overstepping their boundaries, their proper boundaries for their policy.
And a lot of other questions.
A lot of mayors have welcomed this gambit.
I just want to say, how many questions do we have?
We have 3 student questions here.
Okay, so let's take all 3 at the same time, and then.
Yeah, if anything, the way in which it's overstepping is that it's allowing, it's facilitating more of this complete overreach by these states, by these cities. So I don't really like that ploy by Trump. I think that he should focus more directly on hey, if you want funding, you follow the laws of this country, for example.
And I'll let you choose how you answer.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And of course, also just to enforce the law directly, using the agencies so empowered.
Quick questions.
Hindsight is 2020. So if you were a founding father and you could, it seems like populism is the situation we're in has like structural roots in how the U.S. and the rest of the liberal world order is created, and also the content of what's been happening over this, that, identity, whatever. So if you were a founding father and you could, knowing what you know now about what has happened throughout world history, what would you have done either structurally in how America is how the government is structured, or like morally in the education, how could you have prevented or ameliorated the situation? Like, for example, the founding fathers wanted to create a system where people, or like a government for people that can govern themselves, and it seems that we can no longer really govern ourselves. So what if you're a founding father, what could you do to
We're going to take the rest of the questions.
I hate this thing where they ask a bunch of questions at once.
One of the core pillars of I just want
major
by the wealthy elite of America.
to get to the last one first, I believe that there's a major amount of commonality or overlap between the frustration that fuels Sanders' campaign and the enthusiasm for him, for Trump, and now I think the guy's a long shot, but he's one of the most interesting in the field, is Andrew Yang, right? And it's not that the Venn diagram isn't perfect, but there's a ton of overlap, and it shows you how all these phenomena are scrambling what we think of as the traditional ideological divide, where if you could be kind of, if the same type of issue or concern could make you think about Sanders or Yang or Trump, then something's going on that's new. As to the question of what would the founders do differently, I think about that a lot, and I wish I had a great answer. I will say, though, I think Bill will agree with me on this. One of the things we learned in studying political philosophy is the political philosophers tell you you have to temper your hopes about what's possible for politics. So if you think there's one fix that will establish the perfect regime that will last forever, Plato and Aristotle would say there isn't. You're always going to contend with decay and problems and who knows what, and everything human has an endpoint. So
a lot of the things that I would change about our democracy were already implemented from the beginning. So one technical thing is just the Senate being elected by the state legislatures. That was really good. The restriction of the franchise to landowners, that was a good idea. And we stripped those away. So they can never protect us from the alterations that we, a supermajority of the country, agrees with. But for my part, I maybe would make it harder to change the Constitution. But that risks just the complete abrogation of the mechanisms altogether. I don't know. I think that they did a pretty good job. But I wish that we would go closer to their original vision.
I don't know that there's any way to fix the founding in a way to make it completely perfect. If there's one specific thing I would do, I would add one word to the Declaration of Independence, where he says, all men are created equal. It says all men are created equal, that they have unalienable rights, and so on. I would add the word "in" before that, right? Define what equal means in the Declaration.
Very good idea by Michael Anton here.
Independence, because it's quite clear from the rest of the founders' rhetoric, from the Federalist Papers, their letters and everything, that they recognize an inequality of talent, an inequality of judgment, an inequality of virtue, an inequality of the ability to acquire, and so on, and that these are natural inequalities that are going to be spread across every human population. The government not only can't do anything about, but shouldn't try. But the way the Declaration is written, it's hard to criticize Jefferson, but we West Coast Straussians are sort of down on Jefferson, our favorite founders, and more Washington and Madison anyway. If that were just a little clearer, I think we would have had, the phrase would have been less open to misinterpretation and later abuse.
Well,
Final words.
final words, which will be, more.
I just want to zoom in on him during that
People
speech.
mean the Declaration of Independence because it's Jefferson, our favorite founders.
He was not exactly thrilled about that stance taken by Michael Anton, was he? Was he? No siree, no. He was not thrilled. This is not the face of a man who's thrilled.
Washington and Madison anyway. If that were just a little clearer, I think we would have had, the phrase would have been less open to misinterpretation and later abuse.
But very good call by Michael Anton there. Excellent call.
Well,
Final words.
final words, which will be, more like oil on troubled waters than gasoline on a raging fire. First of all, I agree with Michael Anton that not all political problems, and certainly not the deepest and most perennial political problems, have institutional solutions. I think the founders did pretty darn well under the circumstances, but there were some things they did not anticipate, or to the extent that they anticipated them, deplored and hoped would not happen.
Ultra asks, "You're an atheist?" Yes. We could debate that at some point. I haven't had any religion debates on my stream so far, but I'm pretty ready to debate religion if the time comes. Yeah, I'm a stalwart atheist.
Exhibit A, the rise of a party system. But here we are, right? And it's now the basic organizing principle of American politics, and has been for a very long time. And not just N parties, two parties. It appears to be a structural requirement or a structural consequence of decisions that the founders made, not really anticipating that would produce this consequence. But here we are. As far as demagoguery and tyranny, once again, I agree with Michael. These problems are coeval with democracy and coeval with politics, and I don't fault founders for not coming up with a perfect solution. On the question of Trump and constitutionalism, I was very careful, I thought, not to associate Donald Trump with a special threat to constitutionalism. I talked about it as a tendency. I actually had a number of European regimes that we've talked about more in mind than the United States. And I note for the record that Mr. Trump has not yet defied, and I hope will not ever defy, a direct judgment or order of a court. And even though he must have been sorely tempted during the early controversy over the, what some people call the Muslim Exclusion Acts or executive orders, but he kept at it until he had a formula that I don't like any more than the first formula, but which passed judicial muster. So I think a lot of the fear of Trump as the enemy of the Constitution is overwrought. And finally, I think Michael and I have agreed that there is indeed a serious problem with America's political economy, in that our changing class structure is not conducive to the health and perpetuation of its political institutions. And that is really central to the debate, and I don't think anything should be a distraction from that. If I were to fault Mr. Trump, as I have a couple of times, but I don't think this has been an anti-Trump diatribe on my part, I would say that to the extent that he presented himself as the champion of the working class, he hasn't been entirely true to his own convictions and promises. He has not fought seriously for an infrastructure program, even though I can't think of any kind of federal program that would do more good for middle-skilled working class people. A lot of people in Congress said, don't do it, and he didn't. It's exactly the same thing that happened to Bill Clinton in 93 and 94, with all the powers that be told him not to push welfare reform. So he pushed healthcare instead, and got his clock cleaned in 1994. I was there. So I'm with you, and I hope we have a serious discussion in the coming presidential election about what to do about the American middle class. Because if we don't get that right, then getting smaller things right is not going to help us very much. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bill Galston, Michael Anton. Show your popular appreciation.
Nice. Yeah, I might take some clips out of that. I think Michael Anton's last point there was very valuable. Anyway, Ultra Testosterone says, DNA is too complicated, man. We was gods and shit. How can you defend the development of DNA by natural selection processes alone? Well, natural selection... Okay. I think what's currently believed is that some precursor to RNA was selected for, and then there was an RNA world, and then there was a DNA world. But the point is just broadly, the most plausible mechanism for life to arise is the reproduction of chemicals in some kind of environment where those more able to reproduce them or copy themselves do so. If you don't accept that explanation, the question is, what's your more plausible alternative, given that we see before us life? And if you say God, well, what formed the God, right? If the plausibility of the formation mechanism is at issue here, you need a more plausible mechanism in order to displace the one that we presently have. But let's see. Do you have evidence of this? We have evidence in the form of life. So life is evidence of the ability of chemical systems to reproduce themselves. We don't have any examples of abiogenesis, nor would we expect to have any examples of abiogenesis of life arising from non-life, because apparently the frequency with which abiogenesis occurs need only be far, far lower in frequency than that which we would ever observe through any of our experiments, because we have an entire planet of these organic molecules over all these millions of years that have the chance to configure themselves in that manner. Life is not evidence of abiogenesis. Life requires a mechanism to have created it. So the theory that life arose from a chemical soup is a theory, okay? If you don't like that theory, then what's your theory in return? Right? You say that's faith-based, but it's simply the most likely explanation that we have, given the evidence before us. And yeah, so you say it's faith-based. It's the least. It's reaching the least far that we can in order to find an explanation. Well, it's not mere speculation, Ultra. It's like I said, we have logic behind it. So you have to contrast it with some other theory. That's all. So it's the inability to come up with another theory that's even more plausible that is why we accept this present idea for how life arose. All right. Usually we had some people in the Discord in previous streams, but at the moment it seems like the Discord is pretty empty, and so I think I'm gonna be signing off with the end of this video. And good night to everyone. Merry Christmas. I may not be able to be on Luke Ford in the next week. We shall see. But if not, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all of you folks in the chat. Much love. Hope you enjoy your holidays.